The dead possess a weight that the living can never truly replicate. It is a dense, inert heaviness, the physical manifestation of a soul departed, leaving behind only meat and bone to press against the earth. I opened my eyes to the darkness of the grave, that suffocating, crushing pressure of corpses piled atop me like stones on a cairn. The air in the pockets between the bodies was thick, hot, and sweet, with the copper tang of fresh slaughter and the voided bowels of dying men. It was a scent that had coated the inside of my nose for 20 years, the perfume of Outremer, the incense of our martyrdom. I lay still, my breath shallow, listening to the silence of the wadi. It was absolute. No groans, no prayers, no clashing of steel. Just the settling of limbs and the low, hungry buzz of the first flies. My heart beat against the cold mail of my chest. Thump, 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 thump. A treacherous, steady rhythm that mocked my desire for peace. I was alive. Again, I shoved upward, my gauntleted hand slipping on the slick, blood-soaked surcoats of my brothers. A heavy boot pressed against my face. I recognized the repair on the leather strap, the work of Brother Godfrey, who had sat beside me at mess only last night breaking bread. I pushed his leg aside with a grunt of exertion that sounded obscenely loud in the quiet valley, clawing my way toward the sliver of moonlight filtering through the tangle of white wool and crimson gore. When I finally broke the surface, gasping the cool desert air, I fell to my knees in the sand, retching dryly. I was a monster rising from a pit, covered in the blood of 30 holy men, soaked through my gambeson, my mail, my skin, until I felt baptized in their failure. I looked down at my own body, frantically patting my chest, my stomach, my legs. There were bruises, deep and aching. The mail on my left shoulder was sheared, the links broken by a Saracen axe. My helm was dented so deeply it should have driven the steel plate into my skull. But the killing blow, the spear through the lung, the arrow in the throat, missing, always missing. I stood up, my joints popping, a solitary figure in the moonlight casting a long, jagged shadow across the field of the slain. This was the curse of Landry de Saint-Omer, to be the first into the fray and the last one breathing, to watch the light fade from the eyes of better men, men with wives waiting in Provence, men with joy in their hearts, men who had not yet grown cynical and hard like old olive wood. I walked among the ruin of our squadron. We had been the vanguard, a probe sent deep into the hills of Galilee to scout the movements of Saladin's vast host. The ambush had been perfect, a closing jaw of Seljuk horse archers and heavy Mamluk infantry, springing from the rocks like jinns. We had fought with the fury of the cornered, chanting the non-nobi, selling our lives dearly. I remembered the chaos, the screaming of horses, the splintering of ash lances. I remembered charging the standard bearer, dropping my reins and swinging my sword with both hands, seeking the end, begging silently for the steel that would send me home. I remembered the impact of the mace against my helm, the flash of light, and then nothing. Until now. Why? I whispered to the empty air, the word tearing from a throat raw with thirst. Why them, Lord? They were pure. They were ready. I am a husk. I am a sword with a rusted edge. Why do you keep me? The wind did not answer. It merely stirred the hem of my ruined surcoat, drying the blood into a stiff, uncomfortable crust. I was 40 years old, an ancient age for a Templar in the Holy Land, where the average life of a brother was measured in months. I had buried 3 Grand Masters. I had seen the walls of Jerusalem gleam under the sun of victory, and stood in the shadows as the political rot ate away at the kingdom from within. I was a relic, a walking ghost who scared the novices in the preceptory at Acre. They whispered that I had made a pact with a demon, or that I carried a piece of the true cross sewn into my flesh that forbade me to die. They did not know that the only magic I possessed was a terrible, crushing luck that felt less like a blessing and more like a divine rejection. I spent the hours until dawn performing the grim liturgy of the survivor. I moved from body to body, checking for any spark of life, finding none. The Saracens had been thorough, throats were cut, weapons taken, yet in their haste or perhaps in the confusion of twilight, they had missed me, buried as I was beneath the bulk of Brother Tancred and his warhorse. I gathered the signet rings from the stiffening fingers of my brothers, sliding them into a heavy leather sack at my belt. Each ring was a name, a lineage, a promise I had to return to the temple. The weight of the sack pulled at my hip, heavier than any sword. Godfrey, Tancred, Hugh, Robert. I recited their names as I worked, burning them into the scarred tablet of my memory. I was the chronicler of the dead, the keeper of the tally. I found my horse, a massive black destrier named Golgotha, standing near the edge of the wadi, reins trailing in the dust. He was bleeding from a gash in his flank, but he stood steady, a beast as stubborn and cursed as his master. He nickered when he saw me, a low sound of recognition that warmed me despite the chill in my soul. "We are still here, old friend," I murmured, pressing my forehead against his warm neck, smelling the sweat and the horse scent that grounded me in the world of the living. The Reaper walked past us again. "He does not want our company." I checked his wound. It was clean, not deep. He would ride. We would always ride. As the sun began to bleed over the eastern hills, painting the sky in violent purples and reds, colors that mirrored the ground beneath my feet, I mounted Golgotha. I looked back one last time at the heap of white mantles now buzzing with the morning flies. I felt a surge of bitterness so potent it tasted like bile. I wanted to lie down with them. I wanted the silence. I wanted to stop the endless, grinding noise of the war that had consumed my entire adult life. But the vow I had taken at the altar in Paris 20 years ago held me in a grip tighter than iron. Obedience. As long as breath remained, I was a servant. I could not lay down the burden until the Master released me, or until God finally deigned to strike me down. And God, it seemed, was deaf to my pleas. I turned the horse's head west, toward the encampment of the king at Sephoria, toward the coming catastrophe that every veteran could smell on the wind. I rode not as a hero returning, but as a prisoner of life, condemned to walk the earth until I found the answer to the riddle of my survival. The desert stretched out before me, vast and indifferent, a crucible waiting to test a metal that refused to break. The journey to Sephoria was a descent into a furnace. The sun climbed the ladder of the sky, transforming the limestone hills into blinding mirrors that reflected the heat upward, baking the air until every breath felt like inhaling ash. Golgotha plodded forward with a grim mechanical rhythm, his hooves kicking up puffs of white dust that coated my armor, turning the dried blood on my surcoat into a rust-colored paste. I rode in a state of semi-consciousness, a trance induced by thirst and the rhythmic clinking of the bridle. My mind, untethered by conversation or combat, began to wander through the graveyard of my history. It was a crowded place. I remembered the miracle of Montgisard 17 years ago, when I was a squire with a smooth face and a heart full of fire. I remembered being unhorsed, trampled into the mud by a charging Mamluk squadron. I remembered the darkness, the crushing weight of hooves, the certainty of death. Yet when the silence fell, I had crawled out from under a carcass with nothing but a broken rib, while knights in full plate lay twisted and crushed around me. I remembered the siege of Jacob's Ford, the arrows falling like black rain. A shaft had pierced my eye slit, grazing my temple, blinding me with blood, but stopping a fraction of an inch from the brain. I had walked away with a scar and a headache while the garrison was butchered to a man. Each survival felt less like a miracle and more like an indictment. Was my faith insufficient to merit the crown of martyrdom? Was my soul too stained to be accepted into the host of heaven? These questions gnawed at me, more painful than the thirst. I touched the sack of rings at my belt. 30 men, 30 souls accepted, while I was spat back out. I was the coin that the ferryman refused to take. The landscape shimmered, heat waves distorting the horizon, making the scrub brush dance like demons. I drank the last of my tepid water, the liquid tasting of warm leather, doing little to slake the dryness in my throat. I was not riding toward safety. I was riding toward the greatest gathering of Christian might the kingdom of Jerusalem had ever seen, and yet I felt I was riding into a tomb. By midday, the sprawling encampment of Sephoria rose from the dust like a mirage city. Thousands of tents stretched across the plateau, a chaotic tapestry of heraldry and color. The banners of the kingdom, gold crosses on white lions of red, the chevrons of the great houses, hung limp in the stagnant air. From a distance, it looked magnificent, the iron fist of Christendom ready to strike. But as I drew closer, the illusion fractured. I smelled it before I saw the details. The stench of too many men and beasts crowded into too little space, the reek of latrines dug too shallow, the smell of rotting offal and fear. The noise was a dull, thrumming roar, the clang of armorers' hammers, the shouting of sergeants, the braying of mules. It was the sound of a beast, confused, turning in circles, waiting for the butcher. I rode past the outer pickets, my appearance drawing immediate, startled silence. The guards, mercenaries from Genoa with crossbows across their backs, lowered their weapons and stared. I knew what they saw. A lone Templar caked in gore and dust, riding a wounded horse coming from the direction of the slaughter. I was an omen made flesh. I navigated the labyrinth of the camp, ignoring the whispers that trailed in my wake. "It is Saint-Omer," I heard a squire mutter to a knight of Ibelin. "The revenant. They say he cannot die. They say he has no soul left to take." The knight replied, crossing himself surreptitiously. I kept my eyes fixed forward, my face a mask of stone inside my helm. I felt a profound distance from these men. They were worried about glory, about plunder, about the favor of the king. They were sharpening their swords for a battle they believed they would win. I carried the weight of the 30 dead men in the sack at my hip, and I knew that this army was brittle. It was a glass sword, beautiful to behold, but ready to shatter at the first hard blow. I reached the pavilion of the order, a vast structure of black and white canvas, the Beauseant standard hanging motionless above the entrance. Squires ran to take Golgotha's reins, their eyes widening at the blood on the saddle. "Water him," I croaked, sliding from the horse's back. My legs nearly buckled as my boots hit the ground, the impact sending jolts of agony through my bruised frame. "Clean his wound. Feed him grain. If he dies, you answer to me." The boys scrambled to obey, terrified by the rasp in my voice. I limped toward the entrance of the tent, the guards stepping aside without a word. Inside, the air was cooler, scented with rosewater and polished steel. A council was in progress. The Grand Master, Gérard de Riedefort, stood over a map table, surrounded by the senior commanders of the order. Riedefort was a man of violent passions, impulsive and arrogant. His beard already streaked with gray, his eyes burning with a fanatical, dangerous light. He looked up as I entered, irritation flashing across his face at the intrusion, until he recognized me. The silence that filled the tent was sudden and absolute. "Brother Landry," Riedefort said, his voice tight. "You were with the vanguard, with the marshal." He did not ask where the others were. He looked at my bloodied tunic, at the dents in my armor, and he knew. I walked to the table, the heavy oak thick with maps of the Galilee. I unhooked the leather sack from my belt and upended it. The signet rings cascaded onto the parchment. Gold, silver, iron, clattering with a sound like hail on a coffin lid. They spun and settled, a heap of dead authority amongst the drawn lines of wadis and hills. "The vanguard is gone, master," I said, the words heavy and flat, ambushed at the springs of Cresson. 7,000 Saracens against 140. We broke our lances. We emptied our scabbards. They are all with God. A gasp went around the table. Riedefort stared at the rings, his face paling, then flushing with a dark Venus rage. "And you?" he demanded, looking up at me, his eyes searching for a wound that would explain my presence. "I remain," I said simply. "As always." There was no pride in it, only a weary confession. Riedefort slammed his fist onto the table, making the rings jump. 7,000, he muttered. "Saladin mocks us. He spits in our faces." He looked around at the commanders. "We must march. We must meet him. We cannot sit here while he bleeds us white." "Master," I stepped forward, the memory of the ambush still vivid, the way the arrows had darkened the sky, the way the heat had sapped our strength before the first blow was struck. "It is a trap," The springs are dry. The wadis are ovens. Saladin wants us to come to him. He wants us to march across the barren lands to Tiberias. If we leave the water of Sephoria, we die of thirst before we see the Sea of Galilee." My voice was hoarse, desperate. I was not speaking strategy. I was speaking prophecy born of blood. "I saw them, Master. They are light, fast. They will circle us like wolves. We must hold the water. Make him come to us." Ridefort's eyes narrowed. He despised caution. He saw it as cowardice. He walked around the table and stood before me, smelling of perfumed oil and wine, a stark contrast to my stench of death. "You survive, Landry," he sneered, his voice low enough that only the inner circle could hear. "You always survive. Perhaps that is because you fear death too much to embrace it. You speak of traps. I speak of duty. The king looks to the temple for strength, not for excuses to hide behind wells." He turned his back on me, dismissing the warning, dismissing the rings on the table, dismissing the reality of the war for the fantasy of the crusade. "Go to the chaplain. Confess your sins. Wash the blood off. We march at dawn for Tiberias." I stood there for a moment, looking at his back, looking at the map where the route to Tiberias was a line, drawn through empty, waterless white space. I felt a coldness settle in my gut that had nothing to do with the temperature. I realized then that my curse was not just to survive, but to witness. I was the watcher on the wall who sees the fire coming and screams, but has no voice. I gathered the rings back into the sack. I would not leave them there to be swept aside, and turned to leave. The camp outside was still noisy, still vibrant, still full of men polishing armor for a battle they could not win. I walked through the twilight, a ghost among the living, knowing that in 2 days' time this magnificent army would be nothing but food for the crows, and I, God help me, would likely be there to watch the feast. The tension in the air was no longer just the anticipation of war. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of a tomb sealing shut. The march began with a deceptive, glorious fanfare, the kind that history books record but memory struggles to reconcile with the reality of the slaughter that followed. 20,000 men moved as one vast, serpentine organism, a dragon of steel and wool uncoiling from the springs of Sephoria into the barren vastness of the plateau. The king, Guy de Lusignan, rode at the center, surrounded by the high nobility of the kingdom, their surcoats vivid splashes of azure, gules, and gold against the bleached limestone of the road. Above them, bobbing in the heat haze like a golden arc, rode the relic of the true cross, carried by the Bishop of Acre. The soldiers crossed themselves as it passed, their eyes filled with a desperate, hungry adoration. They believed the wood of Christ's execution would shield them from the arrows and the sun. I rode in the rearguard with the Templars and the Hospitallers, and as I watched that golden cross receding into the dust, I felt a blasphemous certainty knot in my stomach. God was not in the wood. God was in the water we were leaving behind. By the third hour, the sun had ceased to be a celestial body and had become a personal, malevolent antagonist. The heat on the plateau of Galilee in July is not merely hot. It is a physical weight, a crushing presence that presses the air out of the lungs and boils the blood in the veins. We were encased in padded gambesons, chainmail, and surcoats, layers of insulation designed to stop steel, now serving to trap every ounce of body heat. Sweat ran down my back in rivulets, soaking my undergarments until they chafed raw against my skin. My helmet became an oven, the metal searing to the touch. Around me, I could hear the change in the army's breathing. The crisp, rhythmic tramp of boots and hooves dissolved into a ragged, stumbling shuffle. The banter of the squires died out, replaced by the heavy, gasping silence of men focusing entirely on the act of placing one foot in front of the other. We were marching into a furnace and the door had clicked shut behind us. Then the Saracens came. They did not meet us in a line of battle, honorable and foolish. They appeared as shimmering phantoms on the ridges, light cavalry on swift ponies that danced over the rocks. They were swarms of hornets, darting in to loose a volley of arrows and wheeling away before our heavy destriers could even turn to face them. The sky darkened with the shafts. They fell with a hiss that sounded like water on hot iron. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound of arrows striking shields, flesh, and wood became the rhythm of the march. Men screamed, short, sharp cries of surprise more than pain, as the bodkin points found gaps in the mail. A sergeant of the Turcopoles riding near me grunted and slumped forward, a shaft vibrating in his neck. I did not stop. We could not stop. To stop was to die. I raised my shield, feeling the impacts shudder through my arm, protecting Golgotha's flank as best I could. The horse was lathered in white foam, his breathing ragged, but he plodded on, trusting me to lead him out of this hell. I had no such trust in my commanders. The psychological torment was worse than the arrows. Saladin knew the land. He knew the wind. As the afternoon wore on and the breeze picked up from the west, his skirmishers lit the scrub. The dry grass, brittle as tinder, caught instantly. Walls of fire raced towards us not to burn us but to choke us. The smoke rolled over the column, thick, acrid, and black. It blinded us, stinging our eyes until tears streamed down our soot-stained faces, mixing with the dust to form a mask of grime. We coughed, retched, and stumbled, isolated in a gray fog of war. In the smoke, the enemy became monsters. We could hear their drums, doom, 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 a relentless heartbeat that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. We could hear their ululating cries, mocking us, promising water they knew we did not have. "Water!" The cry began to ripple through the ranks of the infantry. "Water, for the love of Christ!" Men began to break formation, running blindly towards mirages, only to be cut down by the invisible archers waiting in the smoke. I rode up the line, trying to maintain order among the panicked squires. Through a break in the smoke, I saw the king and the Grand Master arguing. Ridefort was pointing forward towards Tiberias, still miles away across the broken terrain. Count Raymond of Tripoli, the only man among them with the sense God gave a goat, was pointing back or perhaps towards the springs of Kafr Hattin, a closer source of salvation. But the army was a wounded leviathan, too big to turn, too exhausted to maneuver. The momentum was gone. The heat had won. We were grinding to a halt not because of a command, but because the biological limits of men and horses had been reached. We were miles from the Sea of Galilee. We could see it. A tantalizing blue sliver shimmering in the distance below the cliffs, a cruel joke. We were dying of thirst within sight of a lake. The order came down the line as the sun began to dip, turning the smoke-filled sky into a bruised purple bruise. Halt. Camp. It was a death sentence. To camp here on the arid plateau of Lubia, without water, surrounded by an enemy who controlled every approach, was suicide. I looked at Brother Godfrey, a veteran who had ridden with me for a decade. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his eyes sunken and rimmed with red. He looked at me and shook his head slowly. He knew. We all knew. We dismounted, our legs numb and trembling. There was no water for the horses. The beasts stood with heads low, their tongues lolling, too exhausted to even flicker their tails at the flies. The men collapsed where they stood, sleeping in their armor, too afraid or too tired to strip it off. Night fell, but it brought no relief. The heat radiated up from the rocks, keeping the air stifling. The darkness was alive. The Saracens closed the ring around us. Their campfires sprang up on every hill, a circle of thousands of stars that mirrored the indifferent heavens. They were close enough that we could smell their cooking fires, the scent of roasting lamb drifting on the wind to mock our empty bellies. They sang prayers to Allah, their voices carrying clear and victorious in the still air. Inside our camp there was no singing. There was only the sound of men weeping, the dry rasp of prayer, and the screams of the wounded begging for water that did not exist. I sat with my back against Golgotha's flank, sharing his warmth. I took a small stone and put it in my mouth to suck on, a trick of the Bedouin to stimulate saliva, but my mouth was as dry as the dust under my boots. I pulled the sack of rings from my belt and weighed it in my hand. 30 men. Tomorrow the sack would be too heavy to carry. Tomorrow the tally would be beyond counting. I looked at the fires on the hills, then at the silhouette of the true cross, standing stark and lonely against the stars in the center of the doomed camp. It looked like a grave marker. I felt that familiar cold detachment settle over me, the armor of the soul that had kept me sane through 20 years of carnage. The fear was gone. In its place was a terrible, crystalline clarity. I knew exactly how this would end. I knew the taste of the coming defeat, and the cruelest part of the curse whispered to me in the dark. They will all die, and you will watch. I closed my eyes not to sleep, but to wait for the sun that would bring the end of the kingdom of Jerusalem. The night was not a respite. It was a vigil for the dead who were yet to die. Dawn broke like a hammer, shattering a pane of glass. There was no gentle transition from night to day, only the sudden brutal eruption of the sun over the Golan Heights, instantly reigniting the furnace of the plateau. But the sun was the lesser of our enemies. With the light came the smoke. Saladin's men, knowing the wind, had set fire to the dry grass and scrub all around us. We were an island of iron drowning in a sea of gray, choking ash. It filled our helmets, clogged our nostrils, and coated our tongues, which were already swollen black from thirst. The army of Jerusalem, once the pride of Christendom, woke not to a bugle call, but to the collective coughing of 20,000 dying men. I struggled to my feet, my joints locked with stiffness, and looked at Golgotha. The great horse's head hung low, his eyes glazed. He had no moisture left to sweat. I stroked his muzzle, my gauntlet scraping against dry skin. "One more day," I whispered, the words rasping like sandpaper. "Carry me one more day, and I will find you a river." It was a lie. We both knew it. The order to advance came, a confused, panicked shout that rippled down the line. We were moving towards the horns of Hattin, the twin volcanic peaks that loomed through the haze like the headstones of the kingdom. The Sea of Galilee was just beyond them, a few miles of torture away. The Saracens let us move. They were herding us, tightening the noose. As we stumbled forward, the arrows began again. It was a relentless, mechanical slaughter. They did not need to aim. The mass of men and horses was so dense that every shaft found a home. I heard the sickening thwack of bodkins punching through mail and gambeson, the screams of horses rearing in agony, the prayers of men dying in the dust. I rode with my shield raised, feeling the impacts vibrate through my arm, once, twice, a dozen times. A shaft struck my greave, glancing off the steel. Another took a chunk out of my pauldron, but none found my flesh. The curse held. Around me, younger knights, men with agility and strength superior to mine, fell in droves. I saw a squire, a boy of no more than 16, take an arrow in the eye as he turned to look for his master. He fell silently, swallowed by the press of hooves. I did not stop. I could not. The discipline of the army, the iron spine that had held the kingdom together for a century, shattered. The infantry, maddened by thirst and the heat of the fires, broke formation. They did not charge the enemy. They ran blindly towards the cliffs, seeking the mirage of water, abandoning the cavalry. "Stand fast!" the Grand Master roared, his voice cracking, but he was shouting at a tide of panic. The knights were left exposed, a steel shell without a core. The Saracens saw the break and closed in. The constant harassment turned into a full assault. Waves of Mamluk heavy cavalry crashed into our flanks, wielding maces and scimitars. The chaos was absolute. It was a swirling, choking melee of dust, smoke, and blood. I drew my sword, the blade feeling impossibly heavy, and spurred Golgotha into the fray. We fought in a delirium. I have no clear memory of the sequence of the battle, only flashes of intense, visceral violence. I remember the face of a bearded Saracen contorted in a scream as he swung a curved sword at my head. I parried, the shock ringing in my teeth, and thrust my blade into his throat. I remember the smell of burning hair and horseflesh. I remember the king's pavilion. The red tent collapsed, the royal standard wavering. We were being pushed up the slopes of the horns, squeezed onto the rocky summit where the heat was most intense. I found myself fighting beside Brother Godfrey. We were back to back, a two-man fortress in the swirling madness. "For the temple," he wheezed, swinging his mace with the last of his strength. A Saracen lance took him in the gut, lifting him from his saddle. He fell with a crash of armor that sounded like a dropped sack of coins. I turned, roaring a challenge, and cut the head off the lance, but Godfrey was gone, trampled instantly by the press of the enemy. I was alone. Again. The heat was hallucination-inducing. I saw rivers flowing in the sky. I saw demons dancing in the smoke. My thirst was a physical entity, a creature clawing at my throat, demanding blood since there was no water. I saw men, noble knights of high lineage, dismount and surrender, falling to their knees not to pray but to beg for a drop of water. The Saracens cut them down where they knelt. There was no chivalry here. This was an extermination. The true horror was not the death but the slowness of it. We were not dying in a glorious charge. We were being dismantled, piece by the sun and the arrows. I looked towards the center of the ring, where the blue and gold banners still flew. The Bishop of Acre held the true cross aloft, a desperate talisman against the inevitable. But even the wood of Christ seemed to wilt in the heat. Arrows stuck from the relic itself, defiling the holy timber. Then, the end began. Saladin's son, observing from the hills, ordered the final push. The circle collapsed. A wave of enemies surged up the slope. Golgotha, my brave, suffering mount, took a spear in the chest. He did not rear. He simply collapsed, his great heart bursting. I was thrown clear, rolling in the dust, losing my shield. I scrambled to my feet, sword in hand, swaying like a drunkard. I was surrounded by the dead. The ground was carpeted with them, Christians and Saracens locked in a final grotesque embrace. I stood over the carcass of my horse, a lone figure in a white mantle stained red and gray. A group of Mamluks rushed me. I parried, I slashed, I fought with the mechanical precision of a man who has ceased to care about survival. I wanted them to kill me. I lowered my guard slightly, inviting the blow. "Strike me," I screamed in my mind. "End it." But the blow did not come. A mace struck my shoulder, spinning me around, numbing my arm but not breaking the bone. Another blow took me in the back of the knees, driving me to the ground. I waited for the killing thrust, the cold steel entering my neck. Instead, rough hands seized me. My sword was wrenched from my grip. I was hauled to my feet, stripped of my helm. The bright, cruel sun blinded me. I blinked, tears of irritation washing the grit from my eyes. I looked around. The battle was over. The king was captured. The Grand Master was on his knees, bound. The true cross lay in the dust, upside down, a Saracen foot resting on its gold casing. Silence descended on the horns of Hattin, broken only by the moans of the dying and the triumphant shouts of the victors. I stood there, swaying, my hands bound behind my back with rawhide that bit into my flesh. I looked down at my body. I was covered in bruises, my armor was a wreck, but I was whole. The spear had missed. The arrow had missed. The sword had missed. I looked at the mounds of corpses, Godfrey, Tancred, the thousands of nameless infantry. They were free. I was still here. A terrible laughter bubbled up in my chest, a sound of pure madness. I had survived the apocalypse. I was the last leaf on a dead tree, refusing to fall. The Saracen guard pushed me forward towards the tent of Saladin, towards the judgment of the victor. I walked, dragging my feet through the blood of my brothers, and the curse whispered in my ear, louder than ever. "Not yet. You are not done yet." The survival was not a mercy. It was a sentence. And as I looked at the fallen cross, I realized with a jolt of terrifying clarity that my hell was just beginning. I was the witness. I was the memory, and I had no place to hide from the truth of what I had seen. The aftermath of the battle was a theater of humiliation, orchestrated by the victors with chilling precision. We were corralled like cattle, stripped of our weapons, our helmets, and our dignity, and marched past the piles of our own dead to the foot of Saladin's pavilion. The sun was finally setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the devastation, turning the dust into a shimmering haze of gold and red. The thirst was no longer a torment. It was a state of being, a dry madness that made the world edges blur. I stood in the line of captives, swaying, My wrists bound so tightly my hands had gone numb. Ahead of us, the high nobility were being presented to the Sultan. I watched through eyes gritty with sand as King Guy, trembling with a mixture of heatstroke and terror, was offered a chalice of iced rosewater. He drank greedily, the condensation on the cup looking like diamonds, then passed it to Reynald of Châtillon. I saw Saladin's face darken. The code of hospitality had been breached. The Sultan did not strike the blow himself in my vision, but his guards descended. Reynald's head rolled across the carpet. The king fell to his knees in shock. It was over. The kingdom had been decapitated, but for the Templars and Hospitallers, a different fate had been reserved. We were not separated for ransom. We were separated for the sword. Saladin knew that while a king could be bought, a Templar could not be broken. We were the fire in the dry grass, the fanatics who would always return. To kill us was not an act of war, but an act of cleansing. A crier rode down the line of prisoners shouting in Arabic. The guards moved in, grabbing those of us with the red cross or the white star on our chests. "Rejoice," I whispered to the young knight beside me, a boy whose face was a mask of soot and tears. "Do not weep. This is the wedding feast. Tonight, we dine in paradise." He looked at me with wild, terrified eyes, unable to comprehend my joy. I felt a lightness spreading through my chest, a euphoria that banished the pain in my limbs. The curse was breaking. The long, lonely road was finally ending. I was going to die. We were dragged to a low hill overlooking the Sea of Galilee. The irony was cruel. The water was there, beautiful and cool, reflecting the first stars. Yet we would taste only steel. There were hundreds of us, a ragged, bleeding army of martyrs. Saladin had given the honor of our execution not to his soldiers, but to the Sufis and scholars in his train, men of religion, not war. They carried swords they barely knew how to hold. It would not be clean, it would be a butchery. I was forced to my knees in the dirt, the sharp stones digging into my skin. The air was thick with the murmuring of the Pater Noster, rising from hundreds of cracked throats, a low drone of defiance that competed with the victorious chants of Allahu Akbar. I closed my eyes and focused on the darkness behind my lids. I did not pray for salvation. I prayed for the blade to be sharp. I prayed for the aim to be true. I heard the sounds of the slaughter beginning, the wet thud of steel on meat, the gurgling gasps of men choking on their own blood, the chaotic shuffling of the executioners. I did not flinch. I welcomed every sound as a footstep closer to God. The line moved forward. The man to my right, a hospitaller with a beard white as salt, was struck 3 times before he fell. He died silent, his eyes fixed on the sky. Then it was the turn of the boy beside me. He was sobbing now, calling for his mother. "Look at me," I commanded, turning my head. "Look at me, brother, it is only a moment, then the pain is gone." He locked eyes with me, finding an anchor in my calm. The blade came down. It was a clumsy blow striking his shoulder. He screamed. The second blow took his neck. I felt his blood hot on my cheek, a baptism of iron. Then, the shadow fell over me. I looked up. My executioner was a young scholar, his face pale, his hands trembling as he gripped a heavy scimitar. He looked at me, and I saw hesitation in his eyes. I must have looked like a demon, my face caked in gore, my eyes burning with an unnatural, hungry intensity, a scar dissecting my forehead. "Strike," I rasped in Arabic, leaning my neck forward, offering it like a gift. "Do not fear. You send me home." He raised the sword. I closed my eyes. I held my breath. I felt the sack of rings pressing against my hip, the weight of the 30 dead men I carried. "I am coming," I told them. "I am coming to give you back your names." The wind hissed. I waited for the impact. I waited for the darkness. "Stop!" The command was a thunderclap. The air shifted. The anticipation of death, so sharp and sweet, was shattered. I opened my eyes, a roar of frustration building in my throat. A man had stepped between me and the scholar. He was not a soldier. He was an emir, dressed in fine silk, his beard oiled, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He was looking not at my face, but at my belt, at the leather sack. He reached down and snatched it, the weight of it surprising him. He undid the strings and poured the contents into his palm. The signet rings glinted in the torchlight. Gold lions, silver crosses, iron shields, the heraldry of the vanguard, the names of the dead. "You are a thief?" the emir asked, his voice dripping with disgust. "You steal from your own dead?" "I am their memory," I spat back, struggling against my bonds. "They are my brothers. I carry them to the temple. Strike me so I can give them to God myself." The emir stared at the rings, then at me. He saw the bruises, the grazes, the armor that was battered but unbreached. He saw the lack of a killing wound on a man who had clearly been in the heart of the furnace. He looked into my eyes and saw the desperate, howling desire for death. A slow, dawning realization crossed his face, a look of superstitious dread. He closed his hand over the rings and turned to the executioner. "Put up your sword." "No!" I screamed, lunging forward only to be kicked back by a guard. "Kill me! It is my right! I am a Templar! I am your enemy!" The emir leaned down, his face inches from mine. "You are not an enemy," he said softly, his voice chilling my blood. "You are a vessel. I know of you, Afranj, the one who walks through the arrow storms, the one the spirits refuse to touch." He poured the rings back into the sack and tied it to my belt with a deliberate, gentle motion that felt more violating than a blow. "To kill you would be a mercy, and Allah is the most merciful, but he has clearly rejected you." He stood up and signaled to the guards. "This one lives. Do not harm him. He carries the ghosts of the Galilee. If we kill him, they might haunt us. Let him carry them. Let him walk the earth with his burden." "You cannot do this," I roared, tears of pure rage streaming down my face, washing away the blood of the boy who had died beside me. "Cowards, kill me!" But they turned away. The execution continued down the line. I was dragged back, screaming, thrashing, forced to watch as head after head fell. I saw the bodies pile up. I saw the blood soak into the thirsty earth until the ground was mud. I was left alone in the circle of the living, surrounded by the silence of the dead. The sack of rings bumped against my hip, heavy, cold, and mocking. The curse had not broken. It had evolved. I was not just a survivor anymore. I was a rejected soul, denied the release that had been granted to every other man I loved. I knelt in the dirt, the screams of the dying fading into the night, and for the first time in my life I understood the true nature of hell. Hell was not fire. Hell was not pain. Hell was being the only one left to remember. They did not keep me. To keep a ghost is bad luck, and the Saracens, for all their steel and fire, were a superstitious people. They stripped me of my armor, leaving me only my tunic and the sack of rings, and turned me loose on the road to Jerusalem. I walked barefoot over the burning stones, a solitary figure moving against the tide of refugees fleeing the holy city. I was a pariah, a man marked by the invisible hand of God, or the devil, to be untouchable. I passed villagers who crossed themselves and looked away, sensing the stench of the grave that clung to me. I passed patrols of Saracen scouts who reined in their horses and let me pass, their eyes wide with the fear of the uncanny. I was no longer Landry de Saint-Omer, the warrior. I was a walking void, a space where death should have been, but was not. The journey was a blur of heat and silence, my mind a broken kaleidoscope of the faces of the men I had watched die. Every step was a question that hammered against my skull. Why? 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 I reached Jerusalem as the sun was beginning to set, bathing the walls in a light that looked like spilled wine. The city was in a frenzy of terror. Balian of Ibelin was preparing the defense, stripping the silver from the Holy Sepulchre to pay the garrison, knighting squires and merchants in a desperate bid to hold the walls. But I did not go to the walls. I did not go to Balian. I walked through the chaotic streets, a ghost in a city of the living dead, moving with a singular magnetic purpose towards the Temple Mount. The crowds parted for me, silenced by the look in my eyes. I climbed the steps to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the headquarters of our order, the place where Solomon's temple once stood. It was largely abandoned. The brothers who remained were on the ramparts. The servants were packing archives and relics. I walked into the great vaulted hall, the sound of my bare feet slapping against the stone echoing in the vast emptiness. It smelled of beeswax, incense, and the lingering sweat of generations of knights who had knelt here before riding out to die. I approached the altar. It was stripped bare, the golden cross gone, the tapestries removed. It was a slab of cold stone, waiting for the end. I stood before it, my hands trembling as I untied the leather sack at my belt. It was heavy, so terribly heavy. I upended it. The rings poured out, a cascade of gold, silver, and iron. They hit the stone with a cacophony of small, sharp sounds, spinning and settling into a heap of gleaming metal. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was deafening in the silence. I stared at them. The Lion of Godfrey, the Tower of Tancred, the simple iron band of the boy whose name I never learned. 30 lives, 30 lineages, 30 promises broken by the sword and kept only by me. I fell to my knees, my forehead resting against the cold edge of the altar, and I wept. I did not weep for their deaths. I had done that in the desert. I wept for the crushing loneliness of my survival. I am not worthy, I whispered to the empty air. I am the coward who lived. I am the refuse left behind. And then, in the silence of that doomed cathedral, the answer finally came. It did not come as a voice from the heavens, nor as a flash of light. It came as a quiet, settling weight in the center of my chest, a realignment of the soul. I looked at the pile of rings. If I had died at the springs of Cresson, who would have carried Godfrey's ring back? If I had fallen at Hattin, who would have known how the boy died with my name on his lips? If I had been beheaded on the hill, who would be here now, in the heart of the temple, to offer this final testament? The dead have no voice. They have only the silence of the grave. They rely on the living to speak their names, to bear witness to their end, to ensure that their sacrifice is not swallowed by the indifference of time. I realized with a jolt that shook me to my core that my survival was not a rejection. It was a vocation. I was not chosen because I was the best. I was not chosen because I was the holiest. I was chosen because I was strong enough to carry the weight. God did not need another martyr in heaven. He had thousands. He needed a witness on earth. He needed a man who could walk through the fire and not burn, who could look into the abyss of war and not blink, so that the truth of it would not be forgotten. The curse was not that I could not die. The curse was that I had to live for them. I picked up Godfrey's ring, feeling the cold gold against my skin. I was a reliquary. My body was the vessel, my memory, the archive. As long as I drew breath, they were not truly gone. As long as I walked, the order lived. Not in the stone walls that Saladin would surely take, not in the banners that lay trampled in the dust, but in the beat of my heart and the story in my throat. I stood up. The pain in my legs was gone, replaced by a strength that felt ancient and inexhaustible. I gathered the rings back into the sack, moving with a deliberate, ritualistic grace. I tied it securely to my belt. I would not leave them here to be looted by the Saracens. I would carry them. I would carry them to Europe, to the preceptories in France, to the widows in England, to the mothers in Italy. I would look them in the eye and tell them how their sons died, not with fear, but with faith. I would be the living testament of the kingdom of Jerusalem. I turned from the altar and walked back down the nave. The sun had set, and the hall was filled with shadows, but I did not fear the dark anymore. The ghosts were not haunting me. They were escorting me. They were my company, my legion, silent and approving. I walked out of the temple and into the night. The fires of the siege were beginning to light up the horizon, and the drums of Saladin were beating against the walls. The city was about to fall. The era of the cross in the east was ending in blood and fire, but I turned my back on the coming battle. My war was over. I made my way to the postern of St. Lazarus, a small gate unnoticed in the confusion. I slipped out into the darkness of the valley of Hinnom. I did not run. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a man who has a long way to go. I looked up at the stars, the same indifferent stars that had watched us die at Hattin, and for the first time in 20 years I felt a sense of peace. I touched the sack at my hip. I am Landry de Saint-Omer, I thought, the words forming a new vow in my mind. I am the knight of the empty tomb. I am the keeper of the names. The wind blew from the desert, carrying the scent of sage and ancient dust, drying the tears on my face. I wrapped my torn cloak around me and began the long walk to the sea. The story was not over. As long as I lived, the story would never end. I walked into the night, a single candle burning in the void, carrying the light of 30 extinguished stars.